Space was silent, very silent. Far away from Earth, the spacecraft Apollo 13 was flying smoothly through the dark ocean of space. Inside the spacecraft were 3 astronauts. They were calm, they were trained, they believed everything was under control. This mission was supposed to be simple. Apollo 11 had already landed on the moon. Apollo 12 had done the same. Apollo 13 was just another step forward, nothing special, nothing dangerous, at least. That is what everyone thought. Millions of people on Earth were watching. Families were sitting in front of television screens. Children were dreaming of becoming astronauts. Scientists at NASA were relaxed. The launch had gone perfectly. The spacecraft was strong. The crew was experienced. No one expected fear. Inside Apollo 13, the astronauts were floating in zero gravity. They joked with each other. They talked to Mission Control in Houston. Everything sounded normal. Spacecraft systems were working fine. Oxygen tanks were full, power was stable, life was good. Then it happened. A loud bang broke the silence. The spacecraft shook violently. For a moment, no one spoke. The astronauts looked at each other. Their smiles disappeared. Warning lights began to flash. Red lights, yellow lights. Alarms screamed inside the small metal cabin. One of the astronauts quickly checked the control panel. His hands moved fast, but his mind was racing. Something was very wrong. Outside the spacecraft, oxygen was escaping into space. Inside, power levels started to fall. The moon mission was over, but something far worse had begun. Back on Earth, Mission Control was listening. They heard confusion in the astronauts' voices. At first, they thought it was a small problem, maybe a sensor error, maybe a false alarm. But then came the words that changed everything. In a calm but serious voice, one astronaut spoke into the radio, "Houston, we have a problem." Those 6 words froze the room. Engineers stood up. Scientists rushed to their screens. The room was suddenly full of fear. This was not a drill. This was not practice. The astronaut did not panic. He explained what he saw. Oxygen pressure was dropping. Power was failing. Systems were shutting down one by one. Houston tried to understand. How could this happen? Apollo spacecraft were tested again and again. They were built to survive space, but space does not forgive mistakes. Inside Apollo 13, the crew felt the cold. The spacecraft was slowly losing life. Oxygen was not just for breathing, it was also needed to make electricity. Without oxygen, there was no power. Without power, there was no hope. The astronauts knew one thing clearly: they were not landing on the moon. Now, their only mission was survival. They were more than 300,000 kilometers away from Earth. There was no rescue ship, no help nearby, only empty space in every direction. Back in Houston, engineers worked with shaking hands. They had to think fast. Every second mattered. They had to keep 3 men alive with a broken spacecraft. The astronauts followed every order carefully. They turned off systems. They saved power. The cabin became darker, colder, quieter. Fear slowly entered their minds. Would they run out of air? Would they freeze? Would they ever see Earth again? Families of the astronauts were watching on television. They saw the smiles disappear. They heard the serious voices. Mothers prayed. Children cried. The whole world was holding its breath. Apollo 13 was now called a failed mission. But failure was not the real danger. Death was. The astronauts moved into a smaller module, using it as a lifeboat. It was not designed for 3 people for so long. Oxygen was limited. Water was limited. Everything was limited. Still, they did not give up. They trusted Houston. Houston trusted them. The radio connection stayed open. Every word mattered. Every sound from space was listened to carefully. Silence was the enemy. As Apollo 13 continued its journey through darkness, one question echoed in every mind: was that desperate call the beginning of the end or the start of a miracle? The spacecraft moved forward, broken but alive. And the fight for survival had just begun. After the desperate call, space became quiet again. Too quiet. Inside Apollo 13, the astronauts floated without speaking for a few seconds. Their hearts were beating fast. The alarms had stopped, but the danger had not. Silence in space did not mean safety. It meant something was dying. One astronaut slowly looked at the control panel. The numbers did not look right. Oxygen pressure was falling fast. Another astronaut checked the power systems. Fuel cells were shutting down one by one. Lights inside the cabin became dim. This was not a small problem. Outside the spacecraft, something terrible had already happened. One oxygen tank was gone. It had exploded and torn a hole in the service module. Oxygen was rushing out into the darkness like white smoke, but in space there was no sound, no fire, only loss. The astronauts could not see the damage clearly yet. They only felt it. The spacecraft felt weak, like a wounded animal drifting in space. Back on Earth, the engineers stared at their screens. Data was confusing. Some numbers did not make sense. At first, they thought sensors were broken, but then the truth became clear. They were losing oxygen, and without oxygen, Apollo 13 could not survive. The moon was forgotten. The landing plan was canceled. Flags, experiments, and dreams were pushed aside. Only one goal remained now: bring them home. Inside the spacecraft, the temperature began to drop. With less power, heaters stopped working. The metal walls felt cold to the touch. Breath turned slow and heavy. The astronauts spoke calmly, but fear lived behind their words. They were trained for emergencies, but not for this. No one had ever planned for a full oxygen tank explosion in deep space. One astronaut looked through the window. He saw something shining outside. It was oxygen gas escaping, glowing in sunlight. It was beautiful and terrifying. That glow meant death. Every minute more oxygen was lost. The spacecraft could not make electricity. Batteries were draining. Systems were slowly dying, like stars fading one by one. Houston began giving orders. Turn this off, shut that down, save every drop of power, save every breath of air. The astronauts obeyed. They turned off lights. Screens went dark. Fans stopped. The cabin became silent again. Only breathing could be heard. They were now living in a dead spacecraft. The astronauts moved carefully. Floating gently, they checked switches and valves. They worked slowly because panic could kill them faster than space. Time passed strangely. Seconds felt long. Minutes felt endless. Then a new problem appeared. The command module, their main living space, was no longer safe. Oxygen levels were dropping too fast. Power was almost gone. If they stayed there, they would die. Houston made a hard decision. Use the lunar module as a lifeboat. The lunar module was built to land on the moon. It was not made for deep space travel. It was not made for 3 people. It was not made for many days, but it was the only choice. The astronauts carefully moved inside the lunar module. They closed the hatch behind them. The command module was left dark and cold, like a coffin drifting in space. Inside the lunar module, there was little room. They floated close together, their shoulders touched, their knees bumped. There was no privacy, no comfort. Still, they were alive. Houston calculated a new path. The spacecraft would swing around the moon and use its gravity to return to Earth. It was a long journey, a dangerous journey. The astronauts listened quietly. They understood the risk. If one thing went wrong, there would be no second chance. As Apollo 13 continued flying, Earth became a small blue dot far away. Home felt impossible. The astronauts did not know if they would ever touch it again, but they held on to hope. Because in space, hope was the last thing they had, and the explosion that almost killed them was only the beginning of a much darker test. Apollo 13 was no longer a moon mission. It was now a lost ship. The spacecraft moved silently through space, far away from Earth and far away from the moon. It was trapped between 2 worlds belonging to none. Inside the lunar module, the astronauts floated like shadows. The small space felt even smaller now. 3 men, 1 tiny room, limited air, limited power, limited hope. They could not sleep properly. They could not stretch their bodies. Every movement had to be slow and careful. Energy was precious. Even speaking too much used oxygen. Cold slowly filled the module. The heaters were turned off to save power. Temperature dropped again and again. Metal walls became icy. Water formed small ice crystals and floated in the air. Hands felt stiff. Faces looked pale. The astronauts wore all the clothes they had. Still, it was not enough. They were freezing in space. Back on Earth, mission control worked day and night. Engineers did not go home. Coffee cups filled the tables. Papers covered the floor. Everyone knew this mission would change history one way or another. The problem was clear. Apollo 13 had to turn around, but turning a spacecraft in space was not easy. One wrong move could send them spinning forever into darkness. Fuel was limited. Power was low. Computers were off. They had to fly almost blind. Houston gave careful instructions. Every number was calculated by hand. Engineers used pencils, paper, and simple math. No one trusted computers anymore. Inside the lunar module, 1 astronaut held the checklist. Another watched the stars through the small window. The third controlled the engines. They used the stars as guides. No screens, no maps, just stars. The engine burn began. The spacecraft shook gently. The astronauts held their breath. They counted seconds in their heads. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Then the engine stopped. Silence returned. Was it enough? No one knew yet. The astronauts waited. Their hearts beat loudly in their ears. If the burn failed, they would miss Earth completely. They would fly past it and never come back. Houston checked the data. Calculations were fast and tense. Finally, a voice came through the radio. The path was correct. They were heading home, but home was still very far away. As Apollo 13 moved around the moon, the astronauts looked out the window. They saw the moon's surface, cold, empty, and close. It was the closest they would ever be. They were so near, yet so far. The moon passed silently beneath them. No landing, no celebration, only darkness and disappointment. Then a strange feeling filled the module, loneliness. Earth was now behind them. The moon was behind them too. In front of them was nothing but black space. They felt truly alone. 1 astronaut thought about his family. Another thought about his children. The third closed his eyes and prayed quietly. Fear did not shout. It whispered. The cold grew worse. Food was rationed. Water was reduced to almost nothing. Throats felt dry, lips cracked, bodies became weak. Still they followed orders, still they trusted Houston. Carbon dioxide levels began to rise, the air felt heavy, breathing became uncomfortable. This was another silent danger, one they could not see, but Houston had not told them everything yet. Not all problems had solutions. As hours passed, the lunar module felt more like a floating coffin. The astronauts did not say it aloud, but they felt it. Would this small machine really bring them home? Outside, Apollo 13 continued its lonely journey through space, guided by math, hope, and human courage. They were lost between two worlds, and the hardest part of the mission was still waiting for them inside the lunar module. The danger could not be seen. There was no fire, no noise, no warning light, yet it was there. The air was slowly turning against them. The astronauts floated quietly, wrapped in thick clothes, trained to save heat and energy. Their breath sounded louder than before. Not fast, but heavy. Something felt wrong, but no one said it aloud. Then the numbers told the truth. Carbon dioxide levels were rising. Carbon dioxide was the air they breathed out. Normally, filters cleaned it. The filters changed bad air into safe air. But the lunar module was not made for 3 men for many days. Its filters were small, weak, limited. Houston saw the danger first. Engineers stared at the screen in fear. If carbon dioxide reached a certain level, the astronauts would not feel pain, they would feel sleepy. Then confused, then silent, they would fall asleep and never wake up. This was worse than cold, worse than hunger. This was an invisible enemy. Inside the lunar module, Houston spoke carefully. They did not want to scare the crew. Panic could waste oxygen. Panic could kill. They explained the problem in simple words. The astronauts understood immediately. The filters would not last. There were extra filters in the command module, the one they had left behind, cold and powerless. But there was a problem. The filters did not fit. Command module filters were square. Lunar module filters were round. Square could not fit into round. In space, there was no shop, no factory, no second chance. Back on Earth, the room fell silent. Then someone spoke. We have to build a new filter. Not with machines, not with tools, with whatever the astronauts had. Houston gathered engineers around a table. They dumped objects onto it: plastic bags, duct tape, cardboard, socks, manuals. The same objects were floating with the astronauts in space. They had to build a life-saving machine with trash. Time was running out. Engineers worked fast. They talked over each other. They tested ideas. Some failed. Some almost worked. Finally, they had a plan, a strange plan. Houston called Apollo 13. The astronauts listened closely, step by step, slowly, carefully. Take a plastic bag, use cardboard from the checklist. Wrap it with tape, seal every edge. The astronauts followed the instructions like students. Their fingers were cold and slow. Tape was hard to control in zero gravity. Plastic floated away if not held tightly. Every mistake wasted time. Every second brought carbon dioxide closer to danger. Sweat formed on their faces, even in the cold. Breathing felt harder now, heads felt heavy. One astronaut felt dizzy. Another felt pressure behind his eyes. Still they worked. Finally, the strange object was ready. It looked ugly, weak, impossible, a box made from trash. Houston told them to connect it to the air system. The moment felt endless. The astronauts waited. They watched the numbers. Seconds passed. Then something incredible happened. The carbon dioxide level stopped rising. Then it began to fall. A quiet breath of relief filled the lunar module. It worked. Trash had saved their lives, but the victory was small. The cold was still there. Hunger was still there. The journey home was still long. The astronauts leaned back exhausted. They did not cheer. They did not smile. They were too tired. One of them closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly. Clean air. Safe air. For now, outside the spacecraft, space did not care. It remained dark and endless. No applause, no mercy. Inside, 3 men were still alive because of human thinking, teamwork, and hope. Houston continued sending instructions. New problems waited ahead. Power was almost gone. Batteries were weak. Water was nearly finished, but for this moment they had won a battle, not against space, but against the air itself. Apollo 13 continued its journey home. Carrying 3 fragile lives inside a broken machine, the invisible enemy was defeated. But the final test was still coming. Time inside Apollo 13 felt strange. It moved forward, but it also felt frozen. The carbon dioxide problem was solved, but the danger was not over. The lunar module was still cold, very cold. The astronauts were not just uncomfortable anymore. Their bodies were starting to suffer. The temperature inside the module dropped close to freezing. Breath turned into tiny clouds. Water bags became hard with ice. The walls felt like metal from a freezer. The astronauts stopped talking unless it was necessary. Talking used energy. Energy used oxygen. Oxygen was life. They wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they had, jackets, gloves, even spare clothes. Still, the cold went deep into their bones. Sleep became almost impossible. When one astronaut closed his eyes, his body began to shake. Cold woke him again and again. Another astronaut tried to rest, but hunger twisted his stomach. Food was limited. They ate only small bites, just enough to stay alive. Water was worse. To save power, water heaters were turned off. The water was icy. Drinking it hurt their throats. Sometimes they chose not to drink at all. Dehydration slowly weakened them. Back on Earth, doctors watched the data with worry. Body temperatures were dropping, heart rates were changing. If the astronauts became too weak, they might not survive re-entry even if they reached Earth. Houston sent messages of encouragement. Stay strong. You are doing great. We are with you. The astronauts listened quietly. Hearing human voices helped. Silence was dangerous. Silence allowed fear to grow. One astronaut felt pain while urinating. Another felt weak and dizzy. They did not complain. They knew complaining would not change anything. They focused on small tasks, check the systems, record numbers, follow instructions. Hours passed. The spacecraft drifted forward, slowly getting closer to Earth. The blue planet was still far away, but it was no longer just a dot. It was growing. Hope returned little by little, but a new problem appeared. Moisture filled the lunar module. With cold air and breathing bodies, water formed everywhere. It covered walls. It floated as tiny drops. It threatened the electronics. If water touched the wrong switch, everything could fail. The astronauts carefully wiped surfaces with cloth. Every movement was slow, careful, focused. They were tired beyond words. One astronaut began to cough. Another felt chest pain. Fear returned quietly. Would their bodies last long enough? Houston began planning the final steps. The command module had been turned off for days. It was frozen, dead. It had to be turned back on before reaching Earth. But turning it on too early would waste power. Turning it on too late would be fatal. The timing had to be perfect. Inside the lunar module, the astronauts prepared mentally. They knew the hardest part was coming. Re-entry would be violent, hot, dangerous, and they were weak. Still, they trusted the plan. Still, they trusted each other. One astronaut looked out the window again. Earth was brighter now, bigger, beautiful. He did not speak, but his eyes filled with tears. Home was waiting, but space was not done testing them. The cold pressed harder, hunger burned deeper. Exhaustion wrapped around them like a heavy blanket, yet they stayed awake, because sleeping too deeply could mean never waking up. Apollo 13 moved forward through frozen time. Every second survived was a victory, and every breath was borrowed from a broken machine drifting in space. The final challenge was near, and it would decide everything. Apollo 13 was close to Earth now, but close did not mean safe. Inside the lunar module, the astronauts were barely moving. Their bodies were weak from cold, hunger, and lack of water. Faces looked thinner. Eyes looked tired. Every action felt heavy, yet the most dangerous moment was still ahead. To return to Earth, the spacecraft needed one final engine burn. Not a big one, not a long one, but a perfect one. There would be no second chance. The main computer was off. There was not enough power to turn it on. Automatic systems were useless now. Everything had to be done by hand, manual flying in deep space. Houston prepared carefully. Engineers checked numbers again and again. They argued, they tested ideas. They knew one mistake could send the astronauts off course forever. If the burn was too short, the spacecraft would miss Earth. If it was too long, it would burn up in the atmosphere. Perfect timing was everything. Houston sent instructions slowly, clearly, using simple words. The astronauts listened closely. No one interrupted. No one joked. This was not training. This was life or death. Inside the lunar module, one astronaut held a stopwatch. Another watched the stars through the window. The third controlled the engine. They could not see Earth clearly. They could not see the exact path. They used the sun and the stars as guides. Just like ancient sailors, the spacecraft was lined up by hand. Breathing was slow. Hands were shaking, not from fear alone, but from cold and weakness. Houston counted down. 3, 2, 1. The engine fired. The spacecraft began to shake, not violently, not gently, just enough to remind them how fragile they were. The astronaut with the stopwatch began counting seconds in a quiet voice. 10, 11, 12. The one watching the stars adjusted the angle slightly. His eyes burned with focus. If the stars moved too fast, it was wrong. If they moved too slow, it was wrong. 2021. Sweat ran down faces even in the cold. Muscles burned. Every second felt longer than the last. 30:31. Then Houston's voice came. Stop the burn. The engine shut off. Silence returned. The astronauts floated without speaking. Their hearts were beating fast. No one smiled. No one celebrated. They did not know yet. Back on Earth, Mission Control waited. Computers checked the path. Numbers appeared. Calculations ran. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, the result came in. The burn was successful. Apollo 13 was on the correct path to Earth. A quiet cheer moved through Mission Control. Some engineers closed their eyes, some wiped tears away, but Houston did not celebrate loudly. It was not over. The astronauts still had to survive re-entry, and they were not ready. The command module, the only part designed to return to Earth, had been shut down for days. It was cold, damp, lifeless. Turning it back on was extremely dangerous. Power was limited, batteries were weak. One wrong switch could destroy everything. Houston prepared a new checklist, a special one. It had never been used before. The astronauts moved slowly from the lunar module into the command module. The change felt strange. The command module felt like a ghost ship. Ice-covered surfaces. Water floated everywhere. The air was cold and still. They began the power-up process, step by step, switch by switch. Slowly, lights came back on, screens flickered, systems began to wake up, but something was wrong. One battery showed a problem, voltage was too low. If it failed, re-entry would be impossible. Houston adjusted the plan quickly. Engineers changed numbers. They took risks they had never taken before. The astronauts followed every word. Their bodies were shaking now, not just from cold, but from exhaustion. Still, they did not stop. Outside, Earth filled the window, blue, bright, alive home. The lunar module was no longer needed. It had done its job. It had saved their lives. With a final command, the astronauts released it. The lunar module drifted away, slowly disappearing into space. A silent goodbye. Now only the command module remained, and ahead of it waited fire. The atmosphere would burn the spacecraft. Temperatures would rise higher than the surface of the sun. Communication would be lost. If the heat shield failed, they would die in seconds. As Apollo 13 moved closer to Earth, the astronauts prepared for the final fall. They were weak, they were tired, but they were still alive, and the last fire was waiting for them. Apollo 13 was falling toward Earth. Inside the command module, the astronauts were strapped into their seats. Their bodies felt heavy again as gravity slowly returned. After days of floating, even this felt painful. They said very little. There was nothing left to say. Everything that could be done had been done. Now they had to trust the spacecraft, and they had to trust the heat shield. The heat shield was the most important part of the command module. It was designed to protect the astronauts from the fire of re-entry. But no one knew if it was damaged by the explosion days earlier. If it was cracked, if it was broken, the fire would reach inside, and it would be over in seconds. The spacecraft hit the edge of Earth's atmosphere. The temperature rose fast. Outside, air turned into fire. Inside, the command module began to shake violently. The sound was loud, deep, and frightening. It felt like the spacecraft was tearing itself apart. The astronauts stayed still. They followed training. Panic would not help now. Then it happened. The radio went silent. Communication blackout. This was expected. When a spacecraft re-enters the atmosphere, hot air blocks radio signals. Usually the blackout lasts about 3 minutes. 3 minutes of silence, but for Apollo 13, nothing felt normal anymore. Back in Houston, mission control stared at their clocks. No voices, no data, no signs of life. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes passed, still nothing. Families of the astronauts sat in silence. Some held hands. Some closed their eyes. Some could not breathe. The silence felt heavy. Inside the command module, the astronauts felt heat pushing against the walls. The spacecraft shook harder now. The force pressed them into their seats. Breathing felt difficult. One astronaut whispered a short prayer. Another focused on breathing slowly. They could do nothing else. Fire surrounded them. The heat shield burned away, doing its job one layer at a time. The outer surface turned into gas and disappeared. It was planned that way, but was it working? Outside, flames wrapped around the spacecraft like a bright orange storm. Inside, time stretched. 30 seconds felt like hours. In Houston, the blackout time passed its normal limit. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, still nothing. Some engineers lowered their heads. Some refused to look away from the screens. No one spoke. If the heat shield had failed, there would be no warning, no message, no goodbye, only silence. Then a sound. A small crackle, a weak signal. Houston, the room froze. Houston, this is Apollo 13. The voice was tired, but it was alive. Mission control exploded with relief. People stood up. Some cried openly. Some laughed. Some could not move at all. The astronauts had survived re-entry. Inside the command module, the shaking slowed. The fire faded. The pressure eased. The sky outside changed from black to blue. Parachutes deployed first. Small parachutes opened to slow the spacecraft. Then 3 large parachutes bloomed like giant flowers in the sky. Red, white, beautiful, the command module slowed down rapidly. Below them was the ocean, endless blue water. The spacecraft hit the ocean's surface with a loud crash. Water splashed high into the air, then stillness. Apollo 13 floated. It was over. Rescue helicopters rushed toward the landing site. Navy ships moved quickly. Divers jumped into the water. They reached the command module and knocked on the side. Inside, the astronauts heard the sound. They smiled for the first time in days. The hatch was opened. Fresh air rushed in. Sunlight filled the cabin. Strong hands helped them out one by one. They were thin, weak, shaking, but they were alive. Wrapped in blankets, they were lifted onto the rescue ship. Doctors checked them carefully. Cameras captured every moment. The world watched. Apollo 13 had not landed on the moon, but it had achieved something greater. It brought 3 men home from the edge of death. As the command module floated quietly behind the ship, broken but proud, one truth became clear: this was not a story of failure. This was a story of survival, and space would remember Apollo 13 forever. The danger was over, but the story of Apollo 13 was not finished. As the rescue ship moved through the ocean, the astronauts rested under warm blankets. Their bodies were weak, but their minds were finally calm. For the first time in many days, they felt safe. Doctors checked their hearts. Nurses gave them water. Every small action felt like a gift. Simple things, warm air, steady ground, human voices felt new again. They were home. News spread across the world in minutes. Radios, televisions, newspapers all carried the same message. Apollo 13 crew is safe. People cheered. Strangers hugged each other. Families cried with relief. The mission that everyone feared had ended in disaster had instead ended in a miracle. Back at NASA, mission control slowly emptied. Engineers looked tired. Some had not slept properly for days. Coffee cups still sat on tables. Papers were scattered everywhere, but on every face there was pride. They had faced the impossible and won. Apollo 13 was officially called a failure because it never landed on the moon. But deep inside NASA, everyone knew the truth. This was the greatest rescue mission in space history. The spacecraft was damaged. One oxygen tank was destroyed. The mission plan was broken, yet human minds had found a way through chaos. Simple thinking, calm decisions, teamwork, that is what saved the astronauts. Later, the astronauts spoke about their journey. They did not talk about fear first. They talked about trust, trust in each other, trust in the people on Earth, trust in training. They said one mistake could have ended everything. One angry moment, one rushed decision, but they stayed calm. The explosion taught NASA a painful lesson. Small problems could become deadly in space. After Apollo 13, spacecraft designs were changed. Safety rules became stricter, testing became deeper. The mission saved future astronauts. Years later, people would still ask the same question: how did they survive? The answer was simple yet powerful. They survived because humans refused to give up. The lunar module, once meant to land on the moon, became a lifeboat. A box of trash became a machine that cleaned air. Pencils and paper defeated computers. Courage defeated fear. Apollo 13 showed the world that space is beautiful but cruel. It does not care about dreams or plans. It only respects preparation and intelligence. The astronauts returned to normal life, but they were never the same. They had seen how close death could be. They had felt the silence of space, and they had come back. The broken command module was taken away. The mission was written into history books. Movies were made, stories were told again and again, but no story could fully explain those long nights in space. The cold, the hunger, the silence, the hope. Apollo 13 became known by one special name: a successful failure. It failed to reach the moon, but it succeeded in something far greater. It proved that when everything goes wrong, humans can still find a way home. As Earth continued to spin under the stars, one lesson remained clear: space will always be dangerous, but the human spirit is stronger, and the desperate call that once shook the world, "Houston, we have a problem," became a symbol of courage, intelligence, and survival. This was not the end of Apollo 13, this was its legacy. Rocket the end rocket.